I really need to write all this down while I still can. While I'm still sure of what I've seen, hopefully someone can help me or knows what I should do. About 5 weeks ago, I packed everything I owned into my beat-up Dodge Ram and drove from Lenox, Massachusetts to Stagwell, Maine for a delivery driver position at a big distribution center. The pay was way better than what I was making, and rent was half the cost. I was tired of choosing between groceries and gas. At the time, it seemed like the right move. The company closed before my start date. I found out when I showed up, and the building was locked. Not weekend closed. Abandoned. The loading docks were empty, and there was a bank notice taped to the front door about some kind of asset seizure. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for over an hour trying to figure out what to do. I called the manager who hired me, and the number was disconnected. I called the HR line and got a recording saying the mailbox was full. I had already signed a lease on a house outside of town. Spent what little savings I had on the first month and deposit. The money I have left might cover 2 weeks of expenses if I'm careful. Not enough to break the lease and start over somewhere else. Not enough to move back home. So I stayed. That's when I started noticing how people look at me here. Mainers have this thing where, if you weren't born here, you're what they call from away. Doesn't matter if you've lived here 20 years, you're still from away. I expected some cold shoulders and slow service, New England Reserve and all that. But this is different. They stare. Not the normal curious glances you get in a small town when a stranger shows up. These are long, deliberate stares that don't break when you notice. The woman at the grocery store watched me walk down every aisle. Didn't even pretend to be doing anything else. Just stood there by the registers with her arms crossed and followed me with her eyes. The old man who walks his dog goes past my house 4 or 5 times a day. Each time he stops at the end of my driveway and stares at the house for a long time before he moves on. Yesterday I went to the only diner in town for lunch. Every conversation seemed to stop when I walked in, just cut off mid-sentence. A dozen people turned, one by one in their seats and looked at me as I walked to my table. The waitress took my order without writing anything down and never once looked away from my face. When my food came out, it was cold. I ate it anyway because I couldn't afford to waste the money. And I was too nervous to speak up. The whole time I felt eyes on the back of my neck. When I was leaving, 4 of them were standing outside the diner in the cold. No coats. Just standing there watching me get in my truck to leave. I keep the curtains in the house closed now. It doesn't help my nerves. It's old and makes all the sounds old houses make. Floorboards creaking, pipes knocking, windows rattling when the wind picks up. I tell myself they're normal sounds, but they don't feel normal when you're lying awake at night, counting how many times the same pickup truck has driven past in the last hour. I've never met my landlord, by the way. Everything was done through email. I dropped the check in the mailbox on the front door, like he asked. Never got a response, never got a receipt. The check cleared though, so I guess that's something. I tried making conversation at the post office a few days ago. Asked the clerk if there were any places hiring, any restaurants or shops that needed help. She stared at me for a long time before answering. You should stay close to home, especially with the festival coming. What festival? I asked. She didn't blink. The Winter Festival, town tradition. When is it? December 28th. She handed me my mail even though I hadn't given her my name or address. Sorry, but it's not for people from away. I wanted to ask more, but she turned her back and walked into some back room, left me standing there at the counter. That was 2 days ago, and now I'm seeing signs for it everywhere. Handwritten posters stapled to telephone poles, notices taped in shop windows. Winter Festival Deck 28th residents only in marker on white paper. Some of them have drawings on them. Symbols, spirals and branching lines that look like trees or maybe antlers or something else I can't make sense of. I asked my neighbor about it this morning. He's older, maybe 70. Keeps to himself mostly. He's the only person who's even nodded at me since I moved in. I caught him taking his trash out. Hey, I called from my porch. What's this festival everyone keeps mentioning? He stopped moving, completely froze with his hand still gripping the trash bin. When he turned around, the look on his face made my stomach drop. You weren't supposed to be here, he said. His voice was quiet, almost sad. This house was supposed to stay empty this winter. What does that mean? He looked past me at my door, at my windows. Lock your doors at night, keep your curtains closed, and on the 28th, no matter what you hear or what you see, you stay inside. You understand? You stay inside and you don't look. He went back in his house before I could ask anything else. That was 6 hours ago. It's getting dark now. There's someone standing at the edge of the trees behind my house. They've been there for 40 minutes, not moving, just standing there in the cold, watching my house. I don't know what's happening here. I don't know what this festival is, or why everyone keeps saying I shouldn't be here. But December 28th is in 16 short days, and I'm starting to think I'm not just unwelcome in this town. I think something bad is supposed to happen to me. The bus ride out was long and quiet. I spent most of it either staring out the window or drifting in and out of sleep. I was the last one aboard after a few passengers trickled off in small rural towns. The bus suddenly came to a halt, and a distraught man got aboard. He stumbled down the aisle, sat across from me, and began to scribble intently into a battered, leather-bound book. He looked older, maybe in his 60s, tired-looking, wearing well-worn and dirty hiking gear. He spent the whole ride either writing or flipping through the pages. About an hour before my stop, the bus driver called out, "Rainheim National Park Ranger Station." The man abruptly stood up and rushed to the front of the bus. He searched his pockets frantically, then slapped some loose change onto the fare counter before darting off without saying a word. Sometime later, the bus driver called out my stop. As I was about to exit, I noticed that the man from earlier had, in his hurry, left his book on the seat behind the driver. I figured I'd keep it safe. If I saw him again on the trail, I could return it, or I could hand it over to the rangers on my way back home. The trail was empty, except for the occasional deer or rabbit darting between the trees. I spent hours listening to the crunch under my boots, bird calls, and the rustle of leaves and pine needles. As the sun crept closer to the horizon, I figured it was time to set up my camp for the night. I found a suitable spot next to a small stream and began unpacking my backpack. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and boiled water from the stream to rehydrate a freeze-dried meal. The sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature began to sink. I tucked myself into my sleeping bag, but I couldn't shake the urge I had been trying to ignore all evening. I glanced over at the book sitting half buried in the open lid of my pack. I reached for it and flipped to the first few pages. The handwriting was compact but neat. It started off like any trail journal. Short entries about trail conditions, notes on the weather, and a few sketches of flowers. One entry even described a fox encounter in surprisingly poetic detail. I had just turned to another page when I heard a voice call out, "Hello? Anyone there?" I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out. In the dim glow of the dying embers, I could just make out the outline of a man standing a few meters away. "Sorry to bother you. I noticed your fire," the man said. "Would you mind if I pitch my tent here? It's getting late, and I'd rather not stumble around looking for another spot in the dark." Out here, hospitality felt less like a choice and more like an unspoken rule. "Sure, plenty of space," I answered hesitantly. He crouched and began to stir the fire with a practiced hand. With a few quick motions, he coaxed the embers back into a flame. The fire flared brighter than it had all evening, crackling and alive again, pushing back the shadows and fully illuminating his face. He looked to be in his 50s, nearly bald with small patches of hair clinging to his scalp, dark rings around his eyes, and an unshaven jaw. His clothes were covered in dried mud. He smiled faintly. "Hope you don't mind," he said, glancing up at me. He lowered himself onto a rock across from me and warmed his hands over the fire. "My name's Eric," he said after a moment. "You been out here long?" "I'm John. First day out here. You?" "Long enough," he replied with a chuckle. "Well, I don't want to keep you up all night." I crawled back into my sleeping bag as he pitched his tent next to mine. The last thing I saw before I drifted off to sleep was his silhouette, sitting perfectly still by the fire. "Morning," I mumbled, stepping out of my tent. A small kettle of water hissed quietly on a makeshift grate over the flames. "I didn't hear you get up." He glanced at me with a practiced smile. "Got up early and figured I'd boil some water for your coffee." I froze. "How do you know I drink coffee in the morning? I recognized the acidic scent on your breath yesterday. Figured you'd want the water ready," his tone remaining nonchalant. Some habits are hard to miss. I rummaged through my pack and pulled out the small tin of instant coffee. "Well, I've got some bread too if you want some." Eric shook his head. "Thanks, but I've already eaten." He poured the hot water into 2 cups and I stirred some powdered coffee into mine. I reached to pour some into Eric's cup, but he quickly lifted his cup of plain hot water to his mouth and drank it in one swift motion. Perhaps he prefers tea, I thought. Breakfast done, we put out the fire and efficiently packed up the tents and gear. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I unfurled my map and compass and started to plot a course to the next campsite when I felt Eric put his hand on my shoulder. "I know the way," he said simply. There was no arrogance in his tone, only a certainty that left no room for discussion. The air was crisp, and birds called sporadically from the treetops. Eric moved with an ease that made it clear he was more than comfortable here, navigating rocks and inclines without hesitation. We hiked for hours in silence. Curiously, Eric fell back to walk behind me, occasionally offering directions or commenting on my footing. At first, I thought he might have just been giving me space, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he either wanted to watch me or didn't want me to watch him. The forest seemed to respond to our passage. The rustle of leaves was quieter, and the birds that had greeted the morning had gone silent. Eventually, the urge to pee forced me to set my backpack down, and I walked behind a nearby tree. When I returned, I noticed the main compartment zipper on my backpack was pulled down just a crack. "Need anything from my pack?" I asked Eric. "I looked at your compass to make sure we're heading the right way." Not wanting to antagonize my new hiking companion out in the middle of nowhere, I gave him a nod, and we pressed on. The path gradually widened into a clearing, and the new campsite lay ahead. I unpacked my tent while Eric built the fire with practiced motions. "Here, let me help you with that," Eric said quietly and came over to me. He grabbed the tent stakes and drove them into the dirt with his bare, flat palm. Seeing my surprise, he patted my back, his hand feeling cold, even through the fabric of my shirt. He returned to the fire, sitting perfectly still and watching me with unnervingly attentive eyes. As we waited for the water to boil for supper, I retrieved the leather-bound book from my backpack. As I flipped it open, I noticed Eric's eyes slightly widen, a flicker of recognition that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He shifted back into his usual posture, hands resting on his knees, and fixed his gaze on the flames. Settling back against a log, I flipped to where I left off the evening before and continued to read. October 4th, 2025. We made good time to the first campsite, arriving well before sunset. A great start to our 5-day loop. Clear sky, light wind from the west. A gunshot woke me after midnight. Eric's bag was empty. I called for him and received no response. He came out of the dark a few minutes later, said he'd had to scare off a bear lurking around the camp. We'll take a look around the area first thing in the morning. October 5th, 2025. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary around the camp. Found prints, not from a bear though. Eric's been mostly quiet, says he slept badly. Air heavy, with thunderclouds on the horizon, but the storm never came in. Trail mostly dry. October 6th, 2025. I haven't seen Eric eat or drink since yesterday morning. He waved off breakfast. At the stream, he didn't refill his bottle. At lunch, he said he wasn't hungry. Maybe he's queasy. I tried to bring up some old stories. He seemed oddly curious, like it was the first time he had heard them. Didn't add details or correct me the way he always does. Just watched the firewood collapse to coals. Otherwise, it was very humid, and a full moon helped to light up the forest at night. October 7th, 2025. I woke up twice last night. Eric was still up. I don't think he noticed me. I decided to confront him this morning about his strange behavior. He just sat there expressionless. I've noticed that his reactions always come a second too late, like he's trying to figure out how he should respond correctly. His skin looks different too. New wrinkles, a slight yellow tone, and his hair has started to fall out. My only explanation is that something might have poisoned him. October 8th, 2025. It doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, doesn't blink. There is no soul behind its eyes. It just sits by the fire and watches. I cut a hole in the back of my tent. Tonight, I'm leaving. I looked up from the journal and met Eric's eyes across the fire. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without breaking eye contact, he said calmly, "The water is ready." My hand shook as I fumbled with a pack of dried chicken and poured in the hot water. The plastic crinkled loudly in the silence. Eric shifted slightly, the firelight flickering across his face. He opened a small pack of chicken, picked out the pieces of meat with his bare, dirty fingers, rinsed off the sauce in the boiling water, and swallowed the pieces whole. After some time, he spoke. "These woods are old. They have stories if you know how to listen." "What kind of stories?" I asked, careful to not let my unease show. "Well, there's one about a creature that's been here longer than any map or trail. Most people think it's just a local legend, but I've seen signs that suggest otherwise." He leaned forward, and for a moment, his face held what might have been a look of sorrow. "They say a long time ago, there was a man who lived not far from here. A hunter, clever and strong, but with a hunger in him that no food could satisfy. He began to hunt not deer, not rabbit, but people, travelers, wanderers, anyone foolish enough to stray too far into the woods. He ate their flesh, wore their skins, and thought himself above the laws of men. For his crimes, God, or maybe something older, cursed him to walk the forests forever, never resting, never belonging. To torment him further, they say, he was given a gift. He could take the shape of any man or woman and wear any face he desired. He could study them, live beside them, almost fool himself into believing he was human again. Almost." Eric stirred the fire with a stick. No matter how much he learned, how to laugh, how to cry, or how to tell stories, something always betrayed him. His reflection came back wrong. His eyes were void of a soul. And when people noticed, when they looked too closely, well, he had to feed. He paused, letting the silence fill the clearing. "They say he still walks these woods, listening, learning, hoping that someone will mistake him for a human." "Yeah, spooky story," I muttered, no longer able to meet his eyes. My mind raced. Should I make a move, bolt into the forest and risk being caught in the dark, or stay and act like nothing had changed? Every instinct screamed to run, yet my body was frozen in place like a statue. I studied the features of my companion, and with every glance, my stomach twisted tighter. His skin was pale and patchy, loose in some places and stretched too tightly over bone in others. Yellowed with hints of purple bruising around his neck, it looked as though it had begun the early stages of decomposition. Even his breathing seemed off, shallow and deliberate, as though he were carefully measuring the amount of air in each inhale. And yet I had been blind to the truth, staring me in the face. I curled my hands into fists to keep the shaking from showing, forced myself to breathe evenly, and to keep my expression neutral. My mind raced to find the right words, a way to break the tension. I rubbed at my eyes, feigning a tired yawn, and muttered something about turning in early, hoping that my voice didn't reveal the dread that had solidified inside me. Just as my mind had started to pick apart the inconsistencies of his disguise, I couldn't help but wonder if he could do the same to me. I slipped into my tent and pulled the zipper closed with slow, careful hands. My fingers shook as I unfolded the map, the paper crackling far too loudly. I traced the lines with a finger, estimating the nearest road at just over 40 kilometers away. The problem was, I couldn't even be sure of our location, having followed Eric's lead the entire day. It was also a day's trek in daylight, let alone in the middle of the night, but it was the only chance I had. Essentials only. Flashlight, compass, map, knife, water bottle, protein bars, matches, and the journal. I stuffed them all into a small drawstring sack that usually held my sleeping bag. Impelled by the journal entries, I carefully drew the knife from its sheath. I gripped the knife with both hands to steady it and pressed the steel into the tent's nylon until it parted with a faint hiss. I eased myself through the slit, every rustle of the fabric thunderous to my ears, and slipped into the darkness just beyond the firelight. The forest stretched on without end. The only sounds were my rasped breath and the thud of my heartbeat. Beneath it, faint at first, there was something else. A low murmur at the edge of hearing, like someone whispering in the distance. As I ran closer, the sound grew into the unmistakable rush of water. The river was wider than I'd hoped. The moonlight glinted across the surface, silver streaks breaking into shards where the current churned. I hesitated at the riverbank, weighing whether to wade through the freezing water or search for a way around, when a sudden crash echoed from the direction I had come. Twigs snapping, branches splintering. Something was moving fast and coming straight towards me. I ripped the sack from my shoulders and hurled it across the water. It landed with a thud on the gravel on the far shore. I stepped into the water. The cold was immediate and brutal, stabbing like needles up my legs. The current nearly swept me off my feet. It wrenched a boot loose from my left foot and dragged it downstream. I waded toward a massive tangle of driftwood caught against some rocks. My body pressed against the slick wood as I slowly submerged myself, until only my eyes broke the surface. I forced myself to stay still, every muscle locked. It crawled from the trees on all fours, its limbs bending in impossible directions, moving with an unnatural elasticity. Its spine arched grotesquely, inverted like a demonic contortionist. Eric's head was twisted around on his own neck with eyes staring forward. It waded into the water, coming straight toward my hiding spot, each step deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. It stopped and jerked upright, like a dog catching a scent. It sniffed the air and slowly tilted its head downstream. In a sudden blur of motion, it bolted in that direction, thrashing through the water with a speed that defied anything human. I dragged myself from the freezing water and stumbled onto the shore. I collapsed for a moment on the gravel, heaving for air. I slowly managed to stand up, hoisted the sack over my shoulder, and staggered into the trees. My left foot, now only protected by a wet wool sock, hurt with every misstep. Jolts of pain shot up my leg as I stepped on a sharp rock or a pointy twig. I leaned against a tree and slid down until my back rested firmly against the bark. I needed warmth and dry clothing, but a campfire would likely act as a beacon to my location. Hands shivering, I fumbled for my bag and pulled out the leather-bound book. I held it flat to illuminate the pages with the help of the moonlight as I flipped to the next entry. October 9th, 2025. Humans evolved to be expert pattern recognizers. Our brains expend valuable energy analyzing faces in real time. Mouth curvature, the cadence of a blink, the subtle shift of a pupil. Most people don't notice, it's unconscious. But when a detail doesn't fit the expected pattern, something ancient and deep inside us rebels. It's an instinct owned over thousands of years, designed to protect us from the unnatural. If someone is reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. It has spent centuries perfecting its disguise because it craves the one thing it can never truly be, a human. Don't break the illusion. Not for a second, not even in your thoughts. I pushed myself off the tree, every joint stiff, and started walking. I forced my steps to be silent and careful. I waded back across the river. My destination was just a short distance away. On the riverbank, I found a trail of broken branches and followed them until I saw a faint glow flickering between the trees ahead. The campsite looked unchanged. The familiar silhouettes of the tents stood exactly where we had pitched them, but there was no sign of Eric. I stripped off my soaked clothes, hung them over a branch, and dug out a dry set from my bag. I sat down next to the campfire and stretched out my hands to feel the warmth. A shift in the air prickled the back of my neck, and I heard the clicking sounds of joints snapping back into place one by one. I have something I've wanted to tell you. I found this book on the bus. My thumb traced the worn spine as I spoke. I think you know who it belongs to. Perhaps you could return it to its owner for me. Eric stepped out of the darkness. His neck was bruised, and the stretched remnants of his face, pulled too many ways, sagged down, partially covering his eyes and mouth. He looked at me from across the flames, then sat down on the other side. He took the book from me and placed it on the ground next to him dismissively. He then stretched out his other hand, holding something. Found your shoe. I stared down at the dirty sock, protecting my foot for a moment, then forced myself to look up to meet his eyes. Thanks, I managed. Must have slipped off your foot, Eric said casually. I was unlucky. Unlucky? Eric repeated, tasting the word in his mouth. No, you are lucky. Lucky I found it. How would we finish our hike if you couldn't walk properly? Every movement now felt like a performance under scrutiny. Every blink and every word I spoke had to seem natural. Too fast, too slow, too rehearsed, and the fragile illusion I had mended for him would shatter. You should get some sleep. The last leg will be most difficult, Eric stated matter-of-factly. Grateful for the sudden exit, I gave him a small nod and slipped into my tent, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake for hours, listening intently and waiting for something to happen. Morning soon arrived, and I emerged from the tent to find Eric exactly where I had left him, though something was different. The item that had kept me alive was gone. As we packed up the tents for the last time, I spotted the now blackened and gray remnants of leather and paper in the fire pit. The trail was uneven and littered with slippery rocks, wet from overnight dew. Concentrating on each careful step gave me a brief mental reprieve from the predator I could feel stalking just a few paces behind me. As I stepped out of the tree line and onto the road, the footsteps behind me abruptly disappeared. I turned and looked back into the dark woods I had spent the weekend trapped in. The only traces of him were quadrupedal prints pressed into the dirt beside my own boot prints. My mind replayed every moment of the last few days like a nightmare I couldn't shake as I waited for my ride home. The bus rumbled as it pulled away from the stop. I leaned back in my seat, the window cool against my temple, and let out a slow breath. After a while, I slipped a hand into my jacket pocket and felt something dry and brittle. Charred scraps of paper rested in my hand. The edges were blackened and fragile, but the writing was still legible. I took out my phone and opened a blank note. I'm doing my best to recount everything that has happened while the memories are still vivid and fresh in my mind. I worked at the post office 2 weeks ago. That's not a euphemism, and it's not meant to sound mysterious. I've been there since I was 21, sorting, scanning, moving things from one place to another so other people can forget about them. It's stable work, quiet work, the kind of job where nothing interesting is supposed to happen. Every year, around mid-November, I get rotated into a seasonal role. Officially, I'm assigned to the no-response division. Unofficially, I'm the person who sorts the letters addressed to Santa that will never receive an answer. Most people don't realize how many of those come in. Kids still write physical letters. Parents still encourage it. Schools still make it an activity. By the time those envelopes reach us, they're already dead ends. Addresses that don't exist, names that aren't real, return labels written in blocky pencil handwriting. The machinery flags them automatically. They get pulled before routing and dropped into our department. We don't respond to them. We don't forward them to charities. We don't read them in full. That last part is the rule. It's been a rule since the late 90s, according to my supervisor. Long before I started, long before she did. The explanation they give during training is simple and rehearsed. Children sometimes write about personal matters in their letters. Family issues, home situations. It's not our place to read private information that was not meant for us. So we skim. We confirm it's addressed to Santa, stamp it as no response, log it, and file it away. You're allowed to read the opening line, maybe two. You're not allowed to finish it, ever. People joke about it the first year. They think it's superstition, or some old HR leftover nobody bothered to remove. Somebody always asks what happens if you do finish one. The supervisor never answers directly. She just says it results in immediate termination. I believe that was all it meant for a long time. I stopped finding the rule funny 3 Christmases ago. That was when I learned what happens after termination. It's a tight-knit secret among the people who get roped into it, and you're only told after everyone thinks you won't say anything to anyone. They don't escort you out with security. They don't make a scene. You're just told to gather your things and leave the building. Your credentials are deactivated sometime later that day. Your access to internal systems disappears. To everyone else, it looks like you quit or got fired for something mundane. What happens next isn't in any handbook. It starts the same way every time. Within a day or two, the person mentions they feel watched. Maybe they laugh it off at first and blame stress. Then they describe something taller than it should be, standing too far away to make sense. A shape, a silhouette that doesn't move when they move. By the fourth or fifth day, they stop laughing. They all describe it the same way. A black figure, at least 12 feet tall, proportioned wrong, hands stretched to its shins, standing upright like it's pretending to be human. It wears a Santa hat, a real one, red-white trim, cheap felt. The hat never changes, it never falls, it never reacts to weather, it doesn't chase them, it doesn't speak. Every day it's a little closer, it can stand across the street, at the end of a grocery aisle, on a sidewalk in full daylight. Other people walk through it like it isn't there. Nobody notices it. Nobody reacts. That's how they know it's meant only for them. The stocking lasts 12 days. On the 13th, they die. The post office doesn't acknowledge the connection. Officially, those people suffer unrelated accidents or medical emergencies. Unofficially, nobody in no response breaks the rule anymore. Except I did. Because some of the letters aren't normal. Every once in a while, rare, but often enough that we dread it, you find a crumpled envelope sealed with red wax instead of glue. No postage, no return address. Just a name written carefully in pencil, as if the writer didn't want to risk spelling it wrong. Those letters are the reason the rule exists. We're meant to set them aside in a locked drawer and alert supervision immediately. No logging, no scanning. They are taken at the end of the month. Every single one of them is addressed to Santa. I'd seen 11 in my entire career before last week. The 12th had my nephew's name on it. Same first name, same last name. Even the way the pencil curved on the first letter looked wrong in a familiar way. My brother has a 7-year-old son. He writes his name the same way on birthday cards, too big at the front, trailing smaller letters like he gets tired halfway through. I didn't open it right away. I stood there for a long time, staring at the seal, telling myself coincidences happen and kids share names. I told myself that red wax meant nothing, that plenty of children have uncles who work at the post office. I used a sick day and left immediately and drove straight to my brother's house. He laughed when I told him the envelope, told me I was overthinking it, said his kid probably found his wax stamp he used for work and wanted to be fancy. When I asked if his son had written a letter to Santa recently, his smile faded just a little. He said yes, but he didn't see anything alarming, just the usual stuff. Toys, candy, video games. He asked why I cared so much. I didn't have an answer that didn't sound insane. That night, I dreamed about the drawer at work. It was open and the letter was gone. The next morning, I broke the rule. I told myself I'd only read enough to confirm it wasn't really his. I told myself I'd stop if it got personal. I told myself I wouldn't finish it. I was wrong. The letter was written in pencil, neat but deliberate. No spelling mistakes, no childish phrasing. It thanked Santa. It thanked him for the last gift. Not for toys or games, but for a piece of candy that had made Mommy stop crying. It said Santa had been right, that doing the bad thing worked, and nobody knew. It promised that this time would be even better. That stealing wouldn't be enough, and hurting animals felt too small now that he understood what Santa really wanted. It listed sins like chores. It ended by asking what Santa wanted next, because Christmas was coming and he wanted to be a good boy. I don't remember putting the letter down. I only remember my supervisor standing behind me, telling me to hand over my badge. She didn't argue. She didn't yell. She looked tired, like she'd seen this exact situation before and hated it every time. She told me I was terminated for violating confidentiality policy and that I needed to leave the building immediately. She didn't warn me about anything else. I didn't leave work right away. I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost an hour with the letter in my lap. I kept expecting someone to knock on the window and tell me this had gone far enough, that whatever point they were trying to make had landed and I could come back inside. No one did. People clocked out as time went on, walked past my car without looking twice. I drove to my brother's house because there wasn't anywhere else it made sense to go. He answered the door with his son still awake behind him, cartoon voices echoing down the hallway. The normalcy of it made what I was holding feel obscene, like I'd brought something diseased into a clean room. I asked if we could talk privately. He hesitated, then stepped outside with me, shutting the door behind him. Why are you holding Lucas's letter? We were standing on the porch. The light above us flickered every few seconds. I hadn't noticed it doing that before. It came to my work, I said. I need you to read it. You opened my kid's mail? Yes, but you'll understand when you open it. That made it worse somehow. He took the envelope from my hand and turned it over, frowning at the wax seal. What is this? Some kind of joke? Seriously, read it. He broke the seal with his thumb and started scanning the page. I watched his eyes move, line by line. When he stopped, he stared at the paper like he'd lost his place. This isn't funny, he said. I know. He folded the letter once. Did you write this shit? No. Did you put him up to this? No. You really expect me to believe this came from a reel? He stopped himself, laughed once, sharp and humorless. You can't be serious, Matt. I got fired today. I wouldn't risk my job for something like this. That doesn't help. I tried not to read it. I wasn't supposed to. But when I saw his name, "You're talking about rules again," he said. "That stupid Santa rule you're always on about this time of year?" It's not stupid, I said. It's a thing for a reason. So now my son is the reason? His voice was louder now. Behind him, the TV laughed on cue. You think my own son is fucking hurting people? No, I said quickly. I think something is asking him to. He stared at me, waiting for a grin that didn't come. You're sick, man, he said finally after staring daggers at me. It's been happening to other people, co-workers. Once you finish one of these letters I took, this is enough. You don't get to come into my house and say ridiculous shit like this. Just listen to me. Just for once, can you? You need help, Matt. Seriously. You're fucking crazy. There's a thing, my voice dropped without me meaning it to. It starts watching you. Tall, wears a Santa hat, 12 days and then, get out. Don't talk about my son like that. Don't talk to me unless you get your shit together. I'm not talking about him, I said. I'm talking about what's coming. He opened the door behind him. Stay out of my house and don't come back until you can admit you made this up. But Christmas? Don't, he said. Do not bring that bullshit into my home. I stepped back further onto the porch. He didn't hesitate before closing the door. The lock clicked. Behind the door, my nephew laughed at something on the TV. In the silence that followed, the flickering porch light finally went out. At the end of the street, something tall stood perfectly still, waiting. I left my brother's house, not taking my eyes off of it. When I got home, it stood across the street from my apartment, partially hidden by a lamppost that only reached its upper thigh. The Santa hat sat perfectly on its head, bright red against a body that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. I didn't see it move. I watched from my living room window until my eyes started to hurt, until my reflection layered itself over the dark glass and made me doubt the shape even existed. When I looked away and looked back again, it was still at the end of the street, standing just past the stop sign. Cars drove past it without slowing. Headlights cut through its legs and came out the other side unchanged. A woman jogged directly through the space it occupied, earbuds in, breath fogging in the cold air. She never noticed the height of the thing she'd passed. That night, I didn't close the curtains. I wanted to know if it would approach while I slept, if it only moved when I wasn't looking. It didn't move. The Santa hat was the brightest thing on the street. On the second day, it was closer. It stood across from my building beneath a street lamp. The light didn't reveal anything, only traced its outline like something pasted onto the world. I left early, before sunrise, telling myself that if I passed it quickly enough, I could prove it couldn't interact with me. As I walked by, I felt pressure behind my eyes, like I was remembering something I'd forgotten. It lasted less than a second. When I turned, it was still behind me. That night, I dreamed of red wax softening in my hands. On the third day, it was in the parking lot. It stood between my car and the exit. I walked around it without stopping. I remember feeling angry more than afraid, angry that it was allowed to exist like this, violating the basic rules of proximity and consequence. A man leaned against my car to tie his shoe. His shoulder passed through its leg without comment. For a moment, by habit, I drove toward the post office before remembering I no longer worked there. On the fourth day, it began appearing indoors. I saw it at the end of the frozen food aisle, its head nearly brushing the hanging signs. People pushed carts through it, A child ran past me laughing when the cold air hit their face. I left my groceries and walked out. That night, Christmas music started to feel like a warning. On the 5th day, it followed me to my brother's street. It stood on the sidewalk in front of his porch, feet almost touching the step. I watched my brother walk through that space later, holding his son's hand, not slowing, not noticing. The porch light turned on, the door closed, the thing didn't leave. On the 6th day, I stopped trying to explain. I called the non-emergency line. A therapist. Anyone who might give this a shape that wasn't fatal. I talked about stress, unemployment, anxiety. Everyone heard exactly what they needed to hear. That night, it stood at the edge of my building's lot, closer than before. I closed the curtains for the first time and still woke up convinced something brushed the walls. On the 7th day, it was in the elevator to my apartment. The doors opened and it was already there, folded just enough to fit. A woman stepped in beside me and leaned against its leg without realizing it, frowning slightly at the unexpected cold. I got off 2 floors early. The rest of the ride creaked like it was carrying more weight than it should. On the 8th day, it appeared in reflections first. In the dark screen of my phone, in the microwave door, always behind me. When I turned, it was in the room where it needed to be to remain just out of reach. I never heard it breathe. On the 9th day, it stopped giving me space. I turned corners and almost walked into it. I started holding my hands out in front of me, afraid of colliding with it like misplaced furniture. That night, it stood at the foot of my bed and leaned forward just enough to make the Santa hat dip. I didn't sleep. On the 10th day, I tried to leave the city. I drove until the roads thinned and the lights fell away. I locked myself in a rest stop bathroom just to breathe. It waited by the sinks. I turned around and went home. On the 11th day, it no longer followed me. It waited in places before I arrived, positioned where it made sense, as if it had always been part of the layout. If it has eyes, I never saw them. If it has a face, I don't think I would survive seeing it. On the 12th day, it stood in my bedroom, not at the foot of the bed. Closer, it bent at the waist until its head filled my vision. I smelled wax. I smelled paper. The Santa hat slid forward just enough that I thought I might finally see what was underneath. Then it folded itself back into the corner, impossibly small, and waited with me until morning. Tomorrow is the 13th day. He's standing just a few feet in front of me now. I'm going to die tomorrow night. I need help. Anything, please.